Another one that comes to mind would be the Haudenosaunee, or the Iroquois Confederacy, that is especially known from the region of the upstate New York and southern Ontario. So the eastern section of the Great Lakes, especially the areas around Lake Erie, Lake Ontario, and the eastern part of Lake Huron. So the 5 principal nations, then the 6th, the Tuscarora, would come in the 1722, but that's and they also shared a similar language. But the 5 original nations of the Confederacy, Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, and Mohawk. We kind of say SCOOM as an acronym, kind of like a mnemonic to remember the sequence. Each of these nations had its own Iroquoian language that was related to the others. So there was a shared culture. But even though each of the nations had a distinct language, similar to, and again, kind of recalling how English, Dutch, and German, they are distinct enough that they are not mutually intelligible, but you can pick, if you know enough of each of them, you can kind of pick up grammatical similarities. If you know enough English, German is not that hard. So this could be compared to the similarities among each of the 5 nations in the Iroquois Confederacy, that they were all distinct, yet they were close enough linguistically that it allowed them to also communicate, not only across languages, but also across cultures. They shared a common culture by which they could enjoy this political unity within the Confederacy. So they had similar enough languages and a similar enough culture to be considered as a single political unit, which they voluntarily chose to do or to create. There are other Iroquoian languages, such as Cherokee is one of the best known examples. But most of the Iroquoian languages had both linguistic similarity as well as cultural similarity. So that's a case where we do see, again, some diversity, but also unity in terms of thinking about the ways we classify language can very well correspond to ways of classifying societies from ancient to colonial to the modern day. So that's just that's just another example that readily came to mind as I was kind of looking for examples to answer this question. The third one is perhaps the farthest from this answer, where I can say that, yes, in many cases, we can use language to talk about distinct Native American groups in North America, Mesoamerica, and South America. However, when we get to places such as the American Southwest, where we do see, again, great diversity of languages, some regional cultural diversity among the different Pueblo Nations, but also a tremendous diversity of languages within this group. Just looking in the area between Arizona and New Mexico, for example, we find the Tiwa languages. Zuni is not related to anything else in the Americas. It is a language isolate. Hopi is one of the few languages in the area, and I believe it's the only Puebloan language that is Uto-Aztecan. Navajo and Apache are Athabascan languages, and there are questions whether they would also be counted as like the Pueblo societies, because they arrived much later than the other groups that had migrated into the area since almost 1,000 years ago. So we have this diversity of not only different languages, but entirely different language families in this one region. Yet, we do find commonalities: the use of adobe architecture, the Katsina cult, a reliance on maize agriculture, and many aspects of political and kinship organization. So we do find cultural similarities that we can use to group together this common cultural identity of the Pueblo Nations because they have so many cultural elements in common. But in this case, it's an exception because we really can't use languages to group together this entire collective. There are too many different linguistic origins, too many language families to readily equate the similarities of the cultures to the similarities of the languages. In some cases, if we drill down to specific groups, then yes, we can. We could talk about the Towa, the Tiwa, the Tewa of northern New Mexico, for example, that do have shared culture, a shared history, and a shared linguistic origins. So when you go down to the specific Pueblo nations, then yes, you can use language. You can talk about the differences in languages, or just in some cases it's a common language, but diverse dialects or accents within each language. Then in those cases, we can look at the relationship between a common language and a common Pueblo national identity. But going to the scope of the Pueblo groups as a whole, we can't. It's only when we go down to those individual Pueblo nations, that's where we can most readily coordinate linguistic and cultural identity. So I hope these are some kind of good examples. And I'm going to talk about this further because to understand the histories of migrations and movements of people, we do need to think about the what we can reconstruct of these common languages that had a common ancestor, that could have had similar proto-forms of words that they still use in their in their descendant languages.